Good morning, friends. Welcome to today's lecture on Stuart Hall, who, as you were aware, was one of the most important founding figures in the history of the discipline of cultural studies. Stuart Hall was born in Jamaica in the West Indies, and he actually came to England for the first time in the 50s for his master's in the University of Oxford, and he stayed on to pursue his PhD and also, he started a wonderful, rich uh, teaching career, extremely influential teaching career in the University of Birmingham, where he with which he was associated for a long time. And then, of course, he also worked in the Open University of England. And there are so many things that can be spoken of about Stuart Hall and his contribution in different areas of cultural studies has been tremendous, as we are all aware. Um, he made his, impact in so many different fields of the discipline that it's impossible to think of probably any other contemporary thinker of our times who was able to do the same. Um, when you talk about Stuart Hall, you cannot limit him to any one topic or any one area of specialization that we're so used to thinking of. I mean, when you talk about most of the great thinkers of our times, we associate one theory with them, one grand theory or one grand concept with them. But with Stuart Hall, it was much more open and it was much more flexible. It wasn't just about this thing or that, it is always about establishing connections, it is always about establishing dialogues between different ways of looking at things, dialogues between different communities of people, and dialogues between identities. I think this is where Stuart Hall has probably made the most lasting contribution in the history of the discipline of cultural studies. Of course, he was, as we are aware, most of us, he was um, he was a Marxist sociologist, he was a cultural theorist. If you want to, brand him in a way, this is how you would like to think of him. He was a British sociologist, critical theorist, and a political activist. But as I said, I mean, these definitions or these ways of categorizing the contributions of Stuart Hall are problematic because it is always beyond such categorization, as we're going to see in the course of our lecture, hopefully. And we in the beginning of his career, Stuart Hall was also someone who had a great role to play in the um, setting up of the. In fact, he was the first editor of the New Left Review. One of the most important journals in the humanities and social sciences of our time. That was where he first made his academic contribution. Um, really visible, and people started taking note of his this uh, young talent who had um, arrived on the shores of Britain and was making major contributions intellectually and otherwise. And of course, later on, as we are aware, along with Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams, he became one of the founding figures of British cultural studies and of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, particularly. And when you talk about Stuart Hall, and also, in fact, when you talk about Richard Hogarth, It's important to remember the connection with adult education. They were adult education trainees, trainers, both of them, and that had a um, you know an important um, it was an important influence on their later lives because um, having been adult educators, I'm saying this of both Stuart Hall as well as Richard Hogarth, it allowed them access to uh, you know sections of the British communities to which otherwise they probably would not have had access. So people who were generally from the working classes, people who were outside the system of university education, those kind of those kind of communities, and I mean they had access to those kind of communities thanks to the coming of, I mean, their training as adult educators. And primarily, if you talk about Stuart Hall, he was interested in undertaking serious analysis of popular culture, uh, particularly of subcultural forms, and he tried to understand how these were related to issues of, uh, power, politics, and identity. So he did not think of popular culture as being cut off from these things. Popular culture was an integral part of um, I mean, it had to be understood in terms of its relationship with power and authority and you know politics. And questions of identity were very important for Stuart Hall all throughout his life. Questions of identity were extremely important. See, look at his own position in the British world. He was a Jamaican, um, a man of mixed racial heritage, uh, who was teaching in England, a part of British society, but not completely fully integrated, wanting to be sort of assimilated in the British society, but not completely accepted. So he was the kind of eternal stranger, as he liked to uh, define himself in British society, his own position in British society. He was someone who was the perennial outsider. He was there, but he was not there at the same time. I mean, this gave him very interesting perspectives from which he could look at um, the culture of British society, because remember, this is very important. His multi-ethnic, multi-racial heritage, which was used by him to develop his own points of view about British society, and he was therefore like perpetually in exile, perpetually a stranger to British society, a part of it, but not fully integrated. And this is also linked to the fact that as he was not fully integrated, he could align himself politically and emotionally and ideologically with those aspects or those elements of British society which generally were in the periphery, in the margins. So there's this identification, obviously, with the black groups, with the minority migrant groups, uh, those groups who generally were not considered to be an integral part of British society. These were the stereotypes. And these are the stereotypes that precisely that he would start to question later on in his life. Um, but as I said, thanks to his being a perpetual stranger, an eternal stranger in British society, it allowed him to see the lives of these communities who were in the periphery of British society more closely than probably it would have happened otherwise. Um, when you talk about great thinkers of our times, when you talk about all these theories that we have already discussed in the as a as part of this course, we think of all of them as prolific writers, men who wrote great books. Um, most of them are unfortunately men, and we also remember them for the fact that they wrote a number of books. So you have these kind of questions being asked even in exams about uh, who wrote what kind of thing. Now, you would find it really interesting to know that Stuart Hall, in his entire life, did not author any single book. He, of course, edited many books, he edited multiple volumes, but he was not the single author of any book. And yet, he was probably, not probably, definitely, hugely responsible for the flowering of cultural studies in the center at Birmingham, as we are all aware, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. Um, Now, he actually, there's a lesson to be learned from this. He wanted the arts and the humanities and the social sciences to indulge more in collaborative research. There were wonderful working papers and edited volumes that were published by the Center at Birmingham during the 70s and the 80s. And these were all the result of collaborative research. Uh, I can't think of any other times probably or any other center doing this as effectively as the Birmingham Center, and thanks to the contribution of Stuart Hall there. So he was one of the editors in many of these volumes. He's not the sole editor, of course, but for most of these volumes, you find him tying up with someone else and making solid contributions in the field of media, in the field of deviancy, race, politics, Marxism, critical theory, and all of that. And also, Stuart Hall was a wonderful orator. Stuart Hall was a wonderful orator, and people loved listening to him, we're told. And many of his ideas also actually were shared by him in the course of his lectures. So he did not actually write them down. There was a reason for that. We will come to that slightly later. But he was a wonderful orator, and many of these wonderful ideas that we associate with him today um, actually came down to us through his lectures. And two or three of his volumes have now been posthumously published by his friends and collaborators and his students. Um, he, as you were aware, passed away in 2014, and subsequently, some of those lectures that he gave, outstanding lectures that he gave, have been collected and they have been published in the form of books. It was particularly in the year 1979 that Stuart Hall came to limelight with his coining of the term Thatcherism. And this is something that had a lasting impact in terms of the fame and recognition that it earned him. And also, it became a way of defining global polity itself. Thatcherism is so important from the cultural, historical point of view of modern Europe, and in fact, not just modern Europe, of the entire world. Mm, what was this Thatcherism that he introduced? What was this concept of Thatcherism? this is a form of neoconservative politics that was made popular by Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, in the 1970s. And most people underestimated the far-reaching implications of Thatcherism and what it would lead to. Um, but not Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was one of those brilliant minds who pointed at the fact that Thatcherism was going to have a lasting impact on our societies, and he was really critical of the Marxists who were unable to really sort of set the narrative in the 1970s in England, particularly when there was a wonderful opportunity for them, and they let it slip out of their hands. And thanks to their lackadaisical attitude, uh, Thatcherism became immensely popular, and um, it introduced a kind of conservatism and into working class culture, which was going to change the world. Many people would argue forever. And what the Marxists could have done at that point of time, according to Hall, would have been to project an alternative narrative of environmentalism, of civil rights, of multiculturalism. But this is where they had failed, and they had failed miserably. So remember this concept of Thatcherism, which was immensely important in understanding both the philosophy of Stuart Hall as well as in trying to mm, make sense of his deep insights into um, politics. Now, there's as students of cultural studies, we have to face this question almost on a daily basis that what is cultural studies? And this is a question that Stuart Hall had to face as well, being one of the founding figures of the discipline. And uh, he tried to give different definitions, never actually sort of sticking to a very authoritative, you know, mm, uh, final definition of the discipline, but just keeping it open and flexible. Sometimes you'd say that if someone asked him what is cultural studies, you'd say, "Oh, cultural studies, it's just like English literature, except for the fact that you are not dealing only with books, but there are a host of other things that you're dealing with." That would be his response sometimes. Occasionally, he would say that cultural studies is about theories. Cultural studies is mainly about theories for understanding social structures and power. So he gave these different definitions of cultural studies from time to time, and it seems he was pretty flexible about it. And as I had said at the beginning of this lecture, I know this is something very, very important to remember about Stuart Hall. Sorry, he was always able to uh, sort of uh, develop a dialogue between things, and he uh, different ways of looking at things, and he was pretty open to these things. And there's a definite reason as to why he did not give an authoritative definition of cultural studies. One reason why he did not give an authoritative definition of cultural studies was the fact that he did not want his readers to be um, tied down by a definition that he would give them, a bookish definition, an academic definition of cultural studies that he would give them and to which they had to be loyal, right? He wanted the contours and the area of cultural studies to be free. Of course, not without absolute limits, but he wanted to give it that freedom to develop its own tangents, to develop its own trajectories. instead of narrowing it down to one set thing, the way in which he understood it. So there was a definite reason as to why he um, probably did not give any authoritative definitions of cultural studies. Mm, and also he did not suggest, you know, he was not prescriptive about what kind of theoretical resources it should be using, because he wanted to leave that question open to people and for people to decide. And this is the reason probably that in his lifetime he did not publish his lectures. He, as I said, did not want to be seen giving authoritative accounts of the discipline, and he did not want to fix the scope of the discipline. That was the beauty of cultural studies for him, that its scope and its contours were not fixed. Um, One of the important contributions um, that Stuart Hall made to the field of cultural studies, in fact, to the study of culture as a whole, was the fact that he was not just interested in looking at the production of culture, but he was also equally interested in the reception of culture. Um, if you look at most of the thinkers um, till the 70s, um, you find them dealing mainly with the production of culture. The reception of culture was hardly something that was of concern for them, right? So, and anyway, again, coming back to the point that I was making earlier, this is something very typical of Stuart Hall. He always liked to be inclusive in his understanding of a thing. So, if he was looking at the way in which a particular kind of, say for instance, popular culture was imposed on the people, he would also want to know about how people themselves responded to it. And this was not something that uh, for him could only be explained in a one-sided manner, right? Um, you had to look at both the pros and the cons. I mean, you had to look at what was happening at both ends of the tunnel, as it were. So this is important about cultural studies. The contribution of Stuart Hall. Another aspect of cultural studies and the study of popular culture um, that we associate with Stuart Hall was his understanding and his um, understanding of popular culture as a site instead of being something that is fixed and pre-decided. He thought, or he understood popular culture as a site, as a space in which there is constant negotiation going on between, um, uh, you know, the hegemonic powers, those who were powerful at a given point of time, and those who were resisting that power. And the battle was never finally won by anyone. And no one could claim that we have finally won this battle, right? That battle for acceptance and the battle of resistance. I mean, both of these, um, the hegemonic imposition of culture and the resistance of people, they go on at the same time. And this is what makes popular culture, the study of popular culture, particularly exciting. I would like to think of Stuart Hall as someone who was uh, very, very interested in questions of solidarity. He was a Marxist, but no, not an old-fashioned Marxist who was not willing to change. He understood the uh, the changes that were taking place in the society, and he understood therefore, that Marxism had also to change, and he he had this idea of solidarity, of universal solidarity. He greatly valued that, but that would never be at the cost of uh, respect for differences. So what he wanted was respect for differences, but within a sort of broader humanist perspective, or a broader humanist framework of international solidarity. That would be the society where we could have equality and justice for all. A society in which could have greater recognition of difference, but at the same time, we'd also have a common horizon. Common horizon was his term to refer to this um, concept of universal solidarity that was so important for him. And Stuart Hall's vision of culture was always interventionist. Culture must be a way of bringing about changes in society, bringing about positive changes in society, bringing about greater equality and greater justice for people. So, um, for him, you know, it could never be a study of culture, could never be a mere intellectual or academic exercise. It had to um, be political. It had to make interventions in society. It had to change a society for the better. So you can understand from where cultural studies, the discipline of cultural studies, gets its um, its political thrust. One of the founding figures of the discipline, that is Stuart Hall, greatly insisted on the importance of this intervention for the discipline, right? And the importance of intervening in the social world for the studies of culture to have any meaning at all. And remember, this is where cultural studies, of course, is different from most other disciplines. Of course, many disciplines would like to think of themselves as being politically driven or being politically motivated. But the way in which Stuart Hall thought of cultural studies was this. It would never just be, a mere intellectual exercise which is confined to universities, classrooms, to research, blah, blah, blah. But it had always to be mixed with, um, these actual dents that people were making, the researchers were making in the public or in the social life. In fact, in his own life, um, you can see that he was a political activist. He spoke up for whatever he thought was just and proper, and this was something that was not separable from his intellectual and his academic life. His political life was also a part of it. I mean, both of these influenced one another. Now, at the beginning of his career, we find that Stuart Hall was greatly influenced by Louis Althusser, the French structuralist Marxist thinker, and who famously came up with this concept of the ideology and ideological state apparatuses, and how they work um, to create willing subjects for the capitalist system. So I believe some of you have already in fact, all of you probably have already discussed Louis Althusser, and you were aware of the importance of the contribution that he made in this field. But still, a quick reminder: um, Althusser was someone who combined some of the tenets of structuralism with the tenets of Marxism, and he came up with this theory which tried to explain the way in which um, the capitalist system always manages to create more and more willing workers, in spite of the fact that the system was terribly unjust. The capitalist system always succeeds in creating more and more willing workers. How is it able to do this? It's able to do this through ideology. Ideology, according to Althusser, interpellates, calls upon individuals to take up subject positions in society. So, ideology hails or calls upon individuals. It says, you come here, you are a man, you're supposed to behave in this way. Um, if you are a woman, ideology will call you and ask you to occupy a particular subject position and behave like a woman. If you don't do that, of course, you will be subject to the excesses of the repressive state apparatus. I'll not go into the details of Althusser's case here, but uh, Althusser's theory was uh, greatly deterministic in the sense that it doesn't allow for people to respond to the situation that was thrust upon them. The workers, for instance, could only come out of this Althusserian system or Althusserian factory uh, always already brainwashed, right? And this is where he found, towards the later part of his career, that Gramsci was more interesting. And particularly his concept of hegemony was more interesting and more powerful than Althusser's concept because, you know, uh, you were, of course, um, aware of what hegemony is. It's about the winning of consent in order to gain and maintain power. But this position of power that the dominant group occupies is not something that cannot be challenged. It can be challenged, and it had, in fact, people had to make great, this thing to um, the those who were dominant. They had to constantly defend their position, otherwise they were in the danger of losing it. So Gramsci's concept of hegemony allowed the scope for human agency. This is a very, very important concept for Stuart Hall. You will find this in all his essays. So it's not as if people are passive recipients of meaning, individuals are just passive recipients of meaning, and instead, what Hall argues is that individuals have agency, individuals have the freedom to act or not act according to uh, the whims of the market or the whims of the dominant order. They can always resist. So this is what makes Stuart Hall uh, a truly contemporary thinker. And as I had said, I mean, he was always for dialogues. He was always for looking at multiple points of view. And this is why he was so important. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at um, one of his essays, which has become like a milestone in the field of cultural studies. But today's lecture was just meant to be introductory and highlight some of the important contributions of Stuart Hall to our understanding of culture. Thank you.